The Thomas-Morse MB-3 was the first mass-produced American fighter. It was also the aircraft that launched Boeing as a significant player in US aviation. It could even be said to have saved the company, while despite its success, it also led to the demise of Thomas Morse, one of the leaders in early US military aviation. And yet the MB-3 is essentially forgotten. Many casual observers would assume that land-based US aviators flew European Great War era types until the Curtiss PW-8 and Boeing PW-9 turned up in the mid-1920s. But in fact, in the early 20s, every one of the US Army's pursuit squadrons flew the MB-3. The Thomas-Morse Aircraft Company of Ithaca, New York was founded in 1909 as the Thomas Brothers Aeroplane Company. It was, perhaps unsurprisingly given the name, run by the Thomas brothers. They were a pair of British immigrants, William T. Thomas, who in 1908 got a job as an aircraft designer with Curtiss, and his brother Oliver. Entertainingly, their chief designer was the unrelated Benjamin Douglas Thomas, another Englishman who had designed for Sopwith and then Curtiss. It was a trio of Thomases. They successfully sold 24 of their T-2 observation seaplanes to the British Admiralty in 1915, before the breakneck pace of aircraft development in Europe meant that the firm's designs became hopelessly outdated. Although that limited the market for their pursuit aeroplanes, they did sell a considerable number of their S-4 biplanes to the Army and Navy as advanced trainers. Most successful was the S-4C, 497 of which went to the Army, which had also bought 97 S-4Bs. The Navy had 26 of the A, B, and C variants. Manufacturing the S-4 provided valuable manufacturing experience that would influence their next product. It didn't, however, prevent the company getting into financial difficulties in the latter half of 1916. This presented an opportunity for the Morse Chain Company of Ithaca, New York, to deepen their presence in the aviation industry. Morse was backed by Henry Herman Westinghouse, the brother of George Westinghouse and chairman of the eponymous company. Morse had no real aviation experience, but they had supplied engine chains to the Wright brothers. The injection of capital enabled the new Thomas-Morse Aircraft Company to fulfill the orders for the S-4s. Then on the 6th of April 1917, the US entered the First World War. As rearmament began, it was quickly decided that the US was hopelessly behind in aircraft design and would be unable to catch up with European designers in time. What they could, however, do was mass-produce the best Allied designs. Large orders were therefore placed with US manufacturers for French SPAD 13s and British SE5s. This proved to be much harder than expected, though, as European manufacturing standards and practices were totally different than those in the US. In the end, Curtiss would fully manufacture only one aircraft, an SE5, although it did assemble a further 56 from kits shipped to the US from Britain. The problems led to cancellation of the licensed production orders in early 1918 and renewed efforts to develop domestic designs. To aid this effort, a range of types were transported to the US for study, including some now slightly outdated French Nieuport 17s. Since engine design was also far behind, examples of the latest 300 horsepower Hispano-Suiza Model H were sent to Wright-Martin and licenses were negotiated. In response to the request for designs, B.D. Thomas initially sketched two-place aircraft designs, powered by the only US motor that was cutting edge, the 12-cylinder 400 horsepower Liberty. These designs didn't go far, and they were soon superseded by a single-seat fighter powered by the Wright H engine. Production of 4 of these MB-3 aircraft was ordered in November 1918, just as the war was coming to an end. Beside the engine, there was little new or innovative about the MB-3, which was a bit of a mix of various inspirations from the European designers. 20 feet long with a 26-foot wingspan, the 1,700-pound MB-3 strongly resembles the SPAD 7 and 8, with a single upper main plane but separate lower planes. The aerofoil was the popular RAF-15, and whereas the SPAD used box spars and had no dihedral, the MB-3 had solid spars and a 3-degree dihedral on the upper and lower planes. Again, like the SPAD, there were 2 sets of spars, but the inner ones were really just spacers and the aircraft was a single bay. Another SPAD feature was the cockpit ahead of the trailing edge of the upper wing. A cutout was needed to allow the pilot access to the cockpit. The small cockpit meant that dials and controls were scattered wherever there was space. Ergonomic, it was not. More German influence can be seen in the way that the fuselage pinches in behind the atypically large propeller spinner. Fuel was contained in 3 tanks. A 20-gallon tank was under the rudder bar, an 18-gallon in front of the pilot, and a 3-gallon gravity feed tank was on the upper wing. A pair of wind-driven pumps moved fuel up to the gravity tank, from where it was fed into the right motor. 15 gallons of oil was in a horseshoe-shaped tank on the front of the engine crankcase. Armament was in the form of a pair of 0.3-inch Marlin machine guns, mounted behind the cowling for streamlining. This seemed like a good idea, but made maintenance challenging in practice. The MB-3 flew for the first time at the factory's field on the 21st of February 1919. It was then shipped to McCook Field at Dayton, Ohio, for service trials against the Orenco D model. The test pilots liked the aircraft's flying characteristics, particularly the performance bestowed by an engine that was nearly twice as potent as the average fighter motor of the time. At flying weight, it came in at a shade over 2,500 pounds, could hit 140 miles an hour and climb to 19,000 feet. Unfortunately, the pilots hated basically everything else about the aircraft. Even if you had the stature of a jockey, the cockpit was too small. Because the seat was too high, visibility was severely restricted by the upper mainplane. The aircraft also exhibited such obvious structural problems that the pilots were reluctant to fly it. Due to the odd shape of the main fuel tank, it sprung leaks on most flights. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, after 10 hours of flying, the tank's weak mounts broke and it exited the aircraft through the fuselage floor. Poor drainage also allowed engine oil to leak onto the floor of the fuselage and rot the plywood. The engine coolant system was so poor that it needed to be modified early in the flight test program as the engines overheated so quickly. The Orenco was therefore the pilot's choice in the competition, but it too had structural issues and was 338 pounds heavier. The Army therefore decided to order 50 Orencos and 50 Thomas-Morses in fiscal year 1920, which began in July 1919. At this point, the Orenco appeared to be better positioned to be the Army's service pursuit aircraft, but then a quirk of the US government's procurement system intervened against it. In 1919, when the government bought the prototype of a design, they also bought all of the design rights. If it then decided to acquire some aircraft, then they would send out a tender to manufacturers to produce a batch of planes. The designer had no guarantees that they would win a contract. Orenco was a small firm with no mass production experience. Curtiss therefore undercut them and won the contract to build the 50 Orenco planes. As a result, Orenco went out of business in the early 1920s. Thomas-Morse had ended up building 500 aircraft during the war. They had a sizable plant and plenty of capital for machine tools. They were therefore able to bid lowest and make their own aircraft, although the contract was only awarded in June 1920 as the Army was happy enough with its Spads and SE-5s. The final aircraft of the first batch of 50 was delivered by January 1921. The MB-3 had been modified based on the feedback from the Army trials. Most importantly, significant strengthening was applied in the forward fuselage to secure the fuel tank. The radiators were moved to the sides of the fuselage and the plumbing was simplified. This aircraft was designated the MB-3A, but although most of the production batch had the modifications, the first 50 aircraft are known as MB-3s. Irrespective of their name, they were successful planes, and a request for a further 200 was included in the fiscal year 1921 budget. There was not much work going around the industry at the time, and the larger players were scraping by doing renovation work on World War I types like the de Havilland DH-4. These players lobbied for the contract to be split into smaller batches, so that more companies could survive the lean period. But the air service wanted low unit costs, and the best way to get that outcome was to put out a tender to one factory. 6 bids were received, and this time Thomas-Morse were the losers. Boeing undercut them by 25% per airframe. Boeing at the time was a virtual unknown in the industry. The company had been formed in July 1916 as Pacific Aero Products, a partnership between the lumber baron William E. Boeing and Commander Conrad Westervelt, the naval inspector of the Seattle shipyard. Westerwelt was called up after the declaration of war, and Boeing changed the company's name to the Boeing Airplane Company. It constructed 50 training seaplanes for the Navy in 1918, then 25 Curtiss HS-2L flying boats. Thereafter, Boeing's only work was refurbishing DH-4s. Actually, there were two other things it built: 10 of the abysmal Army-designed GA-1 ground attack triplanes and 2 GA-2 biplanes. After the shock of the decision, the other manufacturers made sure to call up Boeing and tell the general manager, Edgar Gott, that he would go broke on the contract. There was good logic for their opinion. At the time, Boeing had no relevant manufacturing experience, no airfield, and no test pilots. But they did have good engineers, good enough to realise early in the tooling up process that the MB-3A was poorly thought out for mass production. It was structurally crude. The stresses that could be generated by a powerful aircraft were readily transmitted to bolts passing through wooden structural members to an airframe that could not absorb the loads. On an early test flight, the Army test pilot Lieutenant Frank Tyndall managed to pull the wings off an MB-3A he was testing over Seattle. Fortunately, he was wearing a parachute and floated down to safety, making him the second US aviator to use one successfully. Many of the other issues were traced back to the Wright Hispano H motor. It was a rough-running engine and not particularly reliable. Fitting a four-bladed propeller smoothed it out somewhat, but by the time it was redesigned, the H was superseded by the new 435 horsepower D12. The four-bladed propeller was manufactured by Boeing under a separate contract, as it was furnished to the manufacturer as GFE. Boeing had a special woodworking shop as a result of the work it had done on boats for the Navy and furniture for civilians, and therefore was a quality producer of props. Fitting the four-blader meant doing away with the integrated spinner. Even after all the changes, the MB-3A was still directionally unstable. Boeing proposed an MB-3B with a lengthened fuselage and 4 ailerons, but the Army saw this as a step too far. Boeing were, however, given a contract to build new tail surfaces for the last 50 aircraft off the line. This tail unit has a less steeply raked fin with larger surface area. Boeing also made a single aircraft with the new fin, 4 ailerons and strengthened engine mounts. It was a great performer, but the Army chose not to purchase it. Despite all of the issues and their own inexperience, Boeing succeeded in making the MB-3As at a phenomenal rate, producing all 200 in less than 5 months. They were delivered to 8 pursuit squadrons, 4 based at Selfridge Field, Michigan, 1 at Luke Field, Hawaii, and another at Wheeler Field, 1 at France Field in the Panama Canal Zone, and 1 at Clark Field in the Philippines. Most of these squadrons focused solely on pursuit. Armament had been revised from the wartime specification of 2 Marlins to 1.3-inch Browning on the left side, and either a Vickers 11mm or the new Browning 50 cal on the right. Light bombs could be carried under the wings, and some would be used as photo reconnaissance aircraft, with cameras stowed behind the pilot's seat. Although a decent aircraft, the obsolete design meant that they didn't last long in service. The last remaining aircraft in Hawaii, the Canal Zone, and the Philippines were withdrawn in 1926. Some became trainers for a year or so. Others were crashed for the filming of the Oscar-winning movie Wings in late 1926. Boeing took a great deal from the experience. They now knew exactly how a fighter should not be built, experience that they directed to their next projects. Thomas-Morse never really recovered. The maker of the US Army's first Indigenous fighter was acquired by Consolidated in 1929, their place in history cruelly forgotten.